Back when Laura and I were still in that awkward phase of not quite dating but spending almost all our free time together, she invited me to spend a weekend snowboarding at her family's cabin in New Hampshire. It was an old, cozy little place, tucked away deep in the woods. The drive up took about 5 hours, and as we got closer, the roads grew narrower, winding through dense forests. Snow-covered trees lined the path, and every now and then, we'd pass a driveway leading to a house barely visible through the thick woods. Most of them looked abandoned, no tire tracks in the snow, no signs of life. Laura told me that many of the homes belonged to out-of-state owners who only visited during peak season, just like her family's cabin. By the time we arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a pale blue glow over everything. The cabin was nestled in a clearing, snow piled up along its sides, making it look like something out of a postcard. We quickly parked, turned on the heat, and unpacked. The cabin had electricity, but no running water, which meant no working toilet. We'd have to use an outhouse, tucked away a little distance from the cabin, a minor inconvenience, Laura assured me. That first night felt peaceful, almost too quiet. We cooked dinner together, watched a couple of movies, and by the time we crawled into bed, we were both exhausted. Tomorrow would be a full day on the slopes, and we fell asleep, not knowing that this weekend would be anything but peaceful. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, I headed out to the outhouse before we left for the slopes. As soon as I stepped into the crisp morning air, something immediately caught my eye. Footprints in the snow. They were larger than mine, and the pattern wasn't quite right. Neither fully human nor animal. The tracks started near the edge of the woods, wrapping around the cabin and disappearing into the trees on the other side. My breath clouded in the cold as I crouched down to get a better look. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't too old. When I called Laura outside to check, she glanced at them and shrugged it off. "It's probably just a black bear," she said casually. "They're common around here." Her explanation didn't ease my nerves, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I brushed it aside. After all, we had a full day of snowboarding ahead of us, and I didn't want anything to spoil the fun. We quickly packed up our gear and headed to the resort. The day flew by as we carved down the mountain, laughing and enjoying ourselves. By the time we finished, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows over the snow. We grabbed dinner at a diner on the way back to the cabin, both exhausted but content. The sky had turned an inky black, and snow had started falling in thick, silent flakes by the time we pulled into the driveway. The wind had picked up, making the entire landscape look eerie and unfamiliar. Once inside, we quickly lit the fire, cranked up the heat, and turned on some music to shake off the growing sense of unease. The storm outside worsened, the wind howling through the trees as the snow piled up higher against the windows. After a while, the warmth and drinks started to work their magic, and we were finally able to relax. But then, nature called. Grumbling, I pulled on my boots and jacket and headed out to the outhouse once again. This time the wind was relentless, biting through my clothes as I trudged through the snow. As soon as I got inside, I slammed the door to keep the cold out and sat down. That's when I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunching of footsteps outside. Cutting through the storm. "Laura?" I called out, hoping she had followed me for some reason. No response. The footsteps continued, moving past the outhouse and fading into the distance. My heart raced. I quickly pulled out my phone and texted her, but it didn't send. The reception out here was terrible, and the message hung there, undelivered. I sat there, frozen, listening for any sound that might clue me in to what, or who, had passed by. Then the music inside the cabin suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was unnerving. No wind, no footsteps, nothing. It felt like the world had gone quiet, all at once. I opened the door, cautiously, stepping out into the cold, and immediately noticed that the cabin was dark. No lights, no flicker of the fire. The power must have gone out. I shone my phone's flashlight toward the cabin, illuminating fresh footprints leading toward the house. My chest tightened as I realized they weren't mine. They trailed up to the front porch, then veered off to the side, wrapping around the cabin toward the back. My hands were shaking as I walked up to the front door, calling out for Laura, my voice swallowed by the storm. Suddenly, the door flew open and Laura yanked me inside, slamming it shut behind me. Her face was as pale as the snow outside, her hands trembling. She barely got the words out before her voice cracked. "Someone tried to open the door while you were gone," she whispered. She explained that after I left for the outhouse, a man had approached the cabin. She'd locked the door immediately, a gut feeling telling her not to wait. When she peeked through the window, she saw him slowly circling the house, looking inside. The moment she realized it wasn't me, she panicked. Her only option was to cut the power and hide, praying he wouldn't see her. My mind raced, trying to process her words. Someone had been watching us, stalking us. I glanced toward the windows, the snow falling harder now. But that didn't bring any comfort. Whoever had been out there knew we were inside, and knew we were isolated. That's when I remembered Laura telling me about the guns her dad kept in the hidden cellar beneath the floorboards. My pulse spiked as I tore through the dark, feeling along the floor until my hand brushed against the cold metal handle. With Laura beside me, we pulled it open, revealing a narrow ladder leading into a small storage space. I descended quickly and grabbed the first rifle I could find, checking it as best as I could in the dim light of my phone. We settled onto the couch, the rifle gripped tightly in my hands, surrounded by pitch-black darkness. We didn't dare turn the lights back on. If the man was still out there, we didn't want to make it easier for him to see inside. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind, the distant rustle of snow hitting the windows. We sat there in tense silence, listening, and then we heard them again. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow. They were getting closer. I stood up, clutching the rifle, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Laura could hear it. The footsteps were right outside the cabin now, circling like before. There was no mistaking it. He was back. My breath caught in my throat as the sound moved toward the front door. Without thinking, I threw it open and fired 3 deafening shots into the storm. I screamed into the night, hoping to scare him off, hoping to hear the sound of retreating footsteps. But all I heard was silence. The wind howled, the snow fell, and there was nothing. No footsteps running away. Just emptiness. We didn't sleep that night. How could we? Every little sound made us jump. We were trapped in that small cabin with no idea if the man had really gone or if he was still lurking somewhere nearby, waiting for us to let our guard down. As soon as the first hint of daylight broke through the storm, we packed up everything we could and got the hell out of there. Laura's father agreed. There wasn't anything worth risking our safety over. He told us to leave and not look back. So we drove away, the cabin vanishing in the distance as the snow swallowed it whole. We never saw the man again. But the memory of those footprints in the snow, circling the cabin, still haunts me. Whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't just passing through. He had been watching us, waiting, and that terrifying thought keeps me up at night. We left New Hampshire behind, but a part of me can't shake the feeling that we were never truly alone that weekend. Not once. In the winter of 2015, Ireland was buried under one of the heaviest snowfalls I'd ever seen. The kind that made everything look peaceful, still, almost like the world was frozen in time. My family had planned a weekend trip to visit some relatives in Cornwall, but I wasn't interested. I didn't get along with them and much preferred staying at home. So, I faked being sick, and to my surprise, they believed me. At 16, they trusted me enough to leave me alone. And honestly, I was more than happy with that. That Saturday felt perfect. I spent most of the day lounging around, switching between Netflix and playing games on my computer. Outside, the snow had piled up, and my dog, who loved the snow even more than I did, was bouncing around in it like a maniac. We played outside for a while, and for a moment, I felt like I had the entire world to myself. By the time evening rolled in, my stomach started rumbling. The house had plenty of food, but most of it required more effort than I felt like putting in. That's when I got the idea to head to the village fish and chip shop. It wasn't far, just down a narrow path we all called the Snicket, lined with old trees and lit by a few street lamps. I'd made the walk hundreds of times before. And despite the deep snow and the fact it was getting dark, I wasn't worried. I grabbed my coat, shoved a tinner into my pocket, and stepped outside. The snow crunched under my boots, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I set off down the familiar route, completely unaware of the nightmare waiting for me. As I clutched my warm meal and made my way back down the Snicket, the last bit of daylight had long faded, leaving the path dimly lit by the few old street lamps scattered along the way. Snow crunched under my feet, the air sharp and cold against my face. It should have felt peaceful, but something was off. That's when I heard it. A twig snapping just off to my right. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I quickly scanned the trees. At first, I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal, a fox, or maybe a squirrel. But then I heard it again, this time closer, followed by two quick snaps, like someone or something was walking through the trees, trying to stay hidden. My heart began to race. I gripped my bag of chips tighter and quickened my pace. The snow muffled my footsteps, but the sounds from the trees were getting louder, more deliberate. Panic set in. I could feel eyes on me, the weight of a presence following just out of sight. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just a dark silhouette, standing under one of the street lamps, barely visible in the faint glow. They were still for a moment, but the second my gaze landed on them, they began sprinting toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. The snow made everything harder. My boots slipped on the icy ground and the cold air burned my lungs as I bolted down the Snicket, the sound of snow crunching beneath the figure's feet, growing louder, closer. My house was just up ahead. I fumbled for my keys as I neared the front door, nearly dropping them in my panic, but I managed to jam them into the lock just in time. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. Breathing hard, I pressed my back against the door and stared out the window. Nothing. The streets were deserted, the snow falling gently, undisturbed. No shadow, no figure. It was like they'd vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing heart, convincing myself it was over. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the snow and the dark had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Later that night, as the clock crept toward midnight, my dog started barking. Not the playful bark she usually made, but a deep, frantic growl directed at the back door. My stomach dropped. She scratched and howled at the door, desperate to get out. Something was out there. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch, not really wanting to know what I'd see. But I couldn't ignore it. I flicked the switch, flooding the backyard with light. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The snow was untouched except for the path I had left earlier. Confusion gave way to dread. Then it hit me. I hadn't used the back door when I came home. My blood turned to ice as I slowly turned toward it, heart pounding in my chest. The door, which should have been locked, was wide open, cold air seeping into the house. I wasn't alone. Realizing the intruder had been inside my house, I felt cold air brush across my face and a wave of dread washed over me. I stood frozen in place, heart pounding, every muscle tense. That's when I heard it. A faint, deliberate thump from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the house, it felt deafening. Whoever had been following me was inside, and they were upstairs. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind raced, searching for what to do. Then, instinct took over. I grabbed my dog by the collar, snatched my phone from the table, and bolted for the front door. The icy air stung my face as I ran across the street to my neighbor's house, heart pounding louder with every step. I slammed my fist against their door, ringing the bell over and over until the porch light flicked on. It felt like an eternity before the door finally creaked open. My neighbor was furious at being woken up, but the look on my face must have told him everything. I blurted out the story between gasps, and his expression softened, worry replacing the anger. He pulled me and my dog inside, locking the door behind us as we waited for the police. The snow had started falling heavily again, delaying the officers. Every minute felt like an hour, the anxiety growing with every creak and groan of the old house. When they finally arrived, they searched the place from top to bottom. But by then, the snow had covered any tracks outside, and inside there was no sign of the intruder. No broken windows, no forced entry, nothing. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. I thought that might be the end of it, a terrifying but explainable mistake. Maybe someone had tried to break in but got scared off. But then the police checked the security footage from the house. The grainy video showed a figure, a dark, shadowy shape, bolting from my back door not long after I had come home. They didn't look around, didn't hesitate. They just ran, straight through the snow and into the woods behind the house. They'd been inside the whole time, waiting for the right moment to leave. And they knew exactly where I lived. The police assured me that it was probably a random incident, just some desperate person looking for an empty house to rob. But that didn't bring me any comfort. We changed the locks, installed new security cameras, and my family never left me alone in the house again. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a faint sound outside, or my dog will bark at the back door, and my heart will race all over again. I'll check the locks, double-check the cameras, but the fear lingers. The thought that someone had been inside my home, that they know where I sleep, it's the kind of thing that never really leaves you. Even now, as the snow begins to fall again, I can't help but remember that night. And I don't think I'll ever feel safe in my own house again. At 25, life had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Since my mom passed away a few years ago, I've taken on a lot of responsibility, especially when it comes to helping out my dad. He's blind, but years ago, he sold a successful building company, so we've never had to worry about money. With multiple properties to manage, I've had to step up and handle most of it since my dad can't really be hands-on with those things anymore. He lives alone now in a small one-story condo, about a 10-minute drive from the house I share with my sister Evelyn. My dad, despite his blindness, is pretty independent. He can take care of most things himself, like walking to the nearby grocery store or doing light shopping. But for things like doctor appointments or anything further away, Evelyn and I have to step in. It's just been the new normal for us. That winter, with the snowstorms rolling in, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Evelyn was staying at her boyfriend's house, which left me alone in our family home. And as the snow piled up outside, I found myself thinking more and more about my dad, wondering if he was okay in that storm. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows as snow piled high against the house. Evelyn was at her boyfriend's place, and I was home alone, trying to distract myself with TV. But my mind kept drifting to my dad. Something felt off, especially with the storm getting worse. I decided to call him just to make sure everything was okay. He usually picks up after the first ring, but this time it rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I waited a few minutes and tried again. Nothing. A knot started forming in my stomach. My dad always answers. I called Evelyn to see if he mentioned leaving the condo for any reason, but she hadn't heard anything. That's when the anxiety kicked in. There was no way I could sit there, waiting for a callback. The storm was brutal and the roads were dangerous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed my keys and headed out, The drive was treacherous, snow piling up faster than the plows could clear it. My phone kept buzzing with storm warnings, but I pushed through, determined to check on my dad. When I finally arrived at his condo, I noticed footprints in the snow, going both toward and away from the front door. Relief washed over me. It looked like he had just gotten home. I knocked on the door, calling out, "Dad, it's me." But no answer came. That's when I heard the voice of his neighbor, Hannah Laura. She opened her door and told me her husband had given my dad a ride to the store not too long ago. That calmed me a bit. But I still felt uneasy. I thanked her and decided to wait inside for him. I reached for my key, but out of habit, I tried the door first. It swung open easily, unlocked again. He never locked the damn door. I told him over and over not to do that, especially since he couldn't see who was coming and going. Irritated, I stepped inside and called for him again, but the condo was eerily quiet. Then I noticed something strange. Melted snow tracks on the floor, leading from the front door and disappearing down the hall toward his bedroom. My heart skipped a beat. I followed the melted snow tracks deeper into the condo, calling out for my dad again. My voice echoed off the walls, but there was still no response. When I reached his bedroom, I saw his phone vibrating on the nightstand, ringing from my earlier calls, but the room was empty. The snow tracks didn't stop there. They led to the bathroom, where the door was shut. That alone was strange. My dad always left doors open so he could move around more easily. Worse, the shower curtain was pulled shut, something he never did because it made navigating harder for him. My pulse quickened. I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at that closed bathroom door, my mind racing with scenarios I didn't want to imagine. Slowly, I backed out of the room, leaving everything as it was. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and immediately called 911. The dispatcher could hear the urgency in my voice, and despite the storm, the police arrived faster than I expected. They told me to wait outside while they checked the place. A few minutes later, they called me back in. I followed them into my dad's bedroom, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, sitting on the edge of my dad's bed with his hands raised, was a man I had never seen before. His clothes were soaked from melted snow, and he sat there calmly, as if he had been expecting us. He didn't try to run or resist. The police quickly arrested him. I was too shocked to even move, my mind still reeling from how close we'd come to something much worse. The man, it turned out, lived just a few units down and had been watching my dad for some time, waiting for an opportunity. That night, he had chosen to break in during the storm, assuming no one would notice. My dad came home not long after, confused and shaken when he heard what had happened. In true form, he didn't want to press charges, saying that the man must have been desperate. But Evelyn and I insisted. We hired a lawyer, and eventually the man was charged with third-degree burglary. He's still in jail. But the fear from that night lingers. To this day, I can't forget that feeling. Standing in my dad's quiet condo, staring at those snow tracks, knowing someone was inside. I keep thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't gone to check on him.